Hey, I want to spend some time today talking about the ancient Near East and also Zoroastrianism and early Judaism. So I'm going to spend a fair amount of time just reading something that I've been researching and working on. All right, so here it goes. The Persian Empire was one of the greatest empires of the ancient world, stretching through much of the modern day Middle East. So this would include Iran, Turkey, Afghanistan, etc., and even into certain parts of Pakistan and Egypt. Cyrus the Great um, of the Persian Empire overthrew the Medians in 550 BCE, leading to the dawn of the Achaemenid Empire, also known as the First Persian Empire. This time frame correlates with the Second Temple period, which is in Judaism, around the time that many Jews returned from their exile from Babylonia after the destruction of Jerusalem. So when the Babylonians came in and captured and destroyed Jerusalem, they dispersed basically everyone to different parts of the Babylonian Empire. This return to Jerusalem was due to an edict issued by King Cyrus of the Persian Empire after the empire conquers Babylon and incorporated it into the fold of empire. A second temple was rebuilt in Jerusalem under Persian patronage, ushering in a new era for the people of Israel. King Cyrus's successor, King Darius, went on to proclaim Zoroastrianism as the state religion of the Persian Empire. Before the rise of the Persian Empire in the Second Temple period, we must place the people of Israel in time. So usually when we think about the Israelites, they're almost like suspended in this sort of like mythological space that is never really assigned a time. So according to Norman Gottwald, who wrote Tribes of Yahweh, Israel would have found its beginnings in Canaan between 1250 and 1000 BCE. Attempting to place Israel any further back in time is very, very uncertain. To better understand the conception of Israel, we must begin necessarily with a body of people in a social movement, which includes diverse traditions focused on the unifying cult of Yahweh. So this is kind of like these dispersed tribes in Canaan kind of rallying together within this cult. Similarly, before the Persian Empire became consolidated, we see tribal activity across much of present-day Iran and Afghanistan. The people inhabiting the Iranian plateau, which would eventually become the Persian Empire's heartland, were settled pastoralists. With the empire, these tribes and villages would have been taken into the fold, most likely through conquering. I'm going to read to you a bit from Judges in the Bible now. In the days of Jael, the highways were abandoned and travelers were kept to the byways. The villagers ceased in Israel. They ceased to be until I arose. I, Deborah, arose as a mother in Israel. So it's important to note here that this is one of the oldest pieces of the Bible. It's a song. It's called the Song of Deborah. And it's located in the book of Judges. And the book of Judges is basically this sort of like loose lineage, like local color kind of stories, myths about what Israel looked like before it was united under a king, and that would be King David. And so basically, Judges is like this crazy spiral out of control cautionary tale about what it means to live without monarchy, which is really interesting. So here, you'll find stories like Samson. That's a good example. The Song of Deborah and Barak details historic locations along with imagery of an interconnected ancient world. Though this is an ancient song, likely composed hundreds of years before the rise of the Persian Empire, at least, we can clearly see that there was lots of movement throughout the Hebrew Bible in the ancient Near East. Cities and villages were frequently laid waste, and we know that certain cities functioned as major trade centers with trade routes just crisscrossing the land. There were massive military campaigns, and there was much intermarriage and intermingling between different peoples, both in the form of political moves and cultural commixing as well. Continuing along these assumptions, it's perfectly reasonable to assume that ideas and belief systems intermingled, as we see many examples in the Hebrew text of Yahweh being worshipped alongside such deities as Baal and Asherah as well. In addition, there's a constant tension between the kings of Israel and allowing their subjects to worship at local high places, use sacred poles, or restrict worship and sacrifice to one location. There was so much tension with the kingship in Israel that it actually splits into a northern and southern kingdom, which are then ruled by two separate kingships. So many kings are damned by the Deuteronomist editors in their decision to loosen stringent religious laws. So the Deuteronomistic editors were basically shaping these original texts to more so fit a later narrative. Following the imagery of movement offered in the Bible, we know that the Persian Empire was a massive trade hub. Major trade routes zigzagged across the ancient Near East into Egypt, and we have plenty of proof of this, and even further through the use of the Silk Road and the spice route. Another win by the Persians was the creation of a canal to allow for trade and passage between the Arabian Sea and the Persian Gulf. That's amazing to me. All of this trade was not only an immense source of material wealth for the empire, but offered the ability for Near and Far East and North Africa to kind of just share and influence religion and culture. So it's important to realize, like when you're looking at the Hebrew Bible, or really anything else, that the ancient Near East is geographically not an amazingly large space. And so with so much movement and conquering happening, it's just impossible for me to believe that these cultures were completely siloed. So like with creation myths and things like that, you'll see so many similarities between deities and that storm god archetype and kind of their views on the world. They're very similar, along with then of course like material culture as well, with the pottery that you see, with the building of the cities, things like that. They're all very similar. So now I'll read a little bit about Zoroaster and Abraham as well, and a bit of similarities between them. So Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, is the progenitor prophet of Zoroastrianism. He would have been born into a Bronze Age pagan culture somewhere in either Iran or Afghanistan. There's great speculation as to when Zoroaster could be placed in time. No one's really been able to assign an exact time to him. So while examining the estimated age of Israel and Zoroastrianism, it's not a far stretch to place him in roughly the same time frame. At 30 years old, he had a divine vision of God, which totally changed his beliefs on religion in the world. So there's some speculation that he might have been a priest before he had his vision. The idea that there is one creator God would have been completely radical at this time, complete major shift in the culture. And little is known of Zoroaster's life outside of what is recorded in the Avesta, the Zoroastrian religious scriptures. We do know, however, that Zoroastrianism was already well established at the rise of the Achaemenid Empire. In an effort to date Zoroaster, his own hymns, the Gathas, abound in references to the institutions, customs, technology, and ways of thought of the traditional pastoral society. So remember, I mentioned that for the kind of like wandering pastoralists for the Israelites. And whereas not a single simile is drawn from agriculture. So it's interesting with agriculture because we have recently discovered proof that there was an agricultural tradition that went thousands of years back, like Stone Age agriculture. So it's hotly contested, honestly. Similarly, Abram, who becomes Abraham, imagining that he was a person who actually walked the earth, was born in the city of Ur and likely had a life similar to Zoroaster. Ur was an important city-state that was involved in trade due to its prime location in southern Iraq, situated where the Tigris and the Euphrates enter the Persian Gulf. So again, think about that trade route, that canal, etc. Ur is cited throughout the Hebrew Bible, so we can imagine the city was of great importance and influence. Abraham is divinely chosen by Yahweh at a much later age than Zoroaster was. He was a very old man to become the patriarch of something truly great. So I'll read from the Bible here. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. That's Genesis 12, verses 2 through 3. Similarly, Zoroaster, represented occasionally as a sorcerer and the father of magic, Abraham's tale is full of miraculous and seemingly magical happenings, including much interaction and interference from the divine. So I've mentioned multiple times that the Hebrew Bible has many dangerous encounters with the divine, and Abraham is a perfect example of it. And so finally, one interesting example of much later authors attempting to weave together Abraham and Zoroaster is through the telling of a story about Abraham being thrown into a fiery furnace by Nimrod. Everyone hates Nimrod, the famous Babylonian Assyrian biblical figure and also king. Curiously, Nimrod is characterized as a fire worshiper. The story is not in the Hebrew Bible, but comes from the Genesis, Rabbah / Midrash, which is kind of the greater collection of Jewish tales in scripture, and was possibly woven together into a coherent story by rabbinic authors, possibly during the Second Temple period. Similarly, in Greek traditions, Zoroaster is also thrown into a fiery furnace only to emerge unscathed. Does that sound like anyone from the Bible? The Greeks also asserted that Abraham and Zoroaster were contemporaries. So that's really interesting. And that was, I'm quoting that from an article by a scholar named Yeshai Kiel. To reiterate, there is no exact date that can be assigned to the life of Zoroaster. And the best estimates place his time anywhere from 1200 to 500 BCE. This is an incredibly interesting example of later works that attempted to syncretize ancient belief systems, especially through much later Islamic authors. So that's an interesting point to explore further. All right, thanks so much.